The night of Charlotte's wedding, the east wing of Harcombe Hall was cold enough that her breath clouded faintly in the corridor outside her assigned chamber, and she stood there a long moment in her plain white nightgown with her hand on the door latch, waiting for a knock that would mean the transaction had begun. She had prepared herself for it the way she prepared for most things in the past 2 years, by pressing the expectation down until it occupied the smallest possible space inside her chest, by naming it a duty rather than a loss, by reminding herself that £4,200 did not vanish on sentiment. She had been told, in the parlance of every woman who had ever advised her on such matters, that the first night was the part a wife endured. She had believed them entirely. What she had not prepared herself for was the quiet footstep outside her door, the pause, and then the sound of a man walking away. She stood at that door for 3 full minutes before she understood. The knock did not come. The latch did not move. The corridor beyond went still as deep water, and Charlotte O'Brien, newly made Duchess of Harcombe at 22 years of age, with borrowed lace at her wrists and a debt instrument in her traveling chest, pressed her forehead gently to the cold wood, and breathed out, very slowly. She had expected to endure. He had refused to let her. She did not yet know what that refusal meant. That knowledge would take weeks, and a forged deed, and a ballroom full of watching faces, and a single sentence spoken across a room to earn. She pulled back from the door, crossed to the window seat, and looked out at the grounds of Harcombe Hall under their first heavy fall of November snow. The parkland stretched away in every direction, white and featureless and vast. She was very far from the cramped Wiltshire house where her father had died in March. She was very far from everything she had known. The only question was whether she had arrived somewhere, or merely been removed. That removal had begun in the solicitor's office in Bath in late September, where Mr. Gerald Holt had laid before her, with the careful respect of a man delivering a sentence he had not written, the full accounting of her father's estate. The figure was £4,200. It was carried across 3 creditors, the most patient of whom had agreed to transfer the instrument of debt to the Duke of Harcombe's house as part of the marriage settlement, provided the marriage took place within 60 days. The least patient had already sent a man to assess the furniture. Charlotte had thanked Mr. Holt for his clarity, walked back to the house in the October rain without an umbrella because she had lent hers to the maid that morning, and sat down at the writing table in the room that had been her father's study and was now merely a room, and she had written her acceptance. She had understood the terms. A Duke of Edmund Ashford's standing did not require a wife with beauty or fortune. He required an arrangement that would not inconvenience him, and a woman willing to manage a household that had been without a mistress for 11 years. In exchange, Charlotte's debts would be discharged, her younger sister Agnes would be given a proper season in the spring, and Charlotte herself would live in material security for the remainder of her life. These were not small things. She had folded the acceptance into its envelope before sentiment could interfere. The journey north to Harcombe Hall had taken 2 days, and Charlotte had spent most of both watching the landscape change from the gentled hills of Wiltshire into the broader, harder country of the North Midlands, where the sky seemed to press closer and the trees stood stripped and unapologetic against it. The hall itself appeared on the 3rd day as the carriage came over a long rise, and the sight of it stopped the breath in her throat for a moment, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was so completely, uncompromisingly itself. Stone the color of old bone, windows tall enough to be formal, and numerous enough to suggest warmth had once been possible inside. 4 wings arranged around a central court, with a long drive cutting through parkland that looked as though it had been managed by the same family for 2 centuries without interruption, which it had. Edmund met her at the foot of the steps. This was the second time she had seen him. The first had been a 30-minute interview in a Bath drawing room in August, where he had asked her 3 questions about household management and 1 about her health, and she had answered all 4 without looking away from his face, because she had decided on the journey over that whatever she found there she would not flinch from. What she had found was a man of 38, with a face that gave nothing away at will, a jaw that appeared to have been designed for the particular purpose of containment, and eyes the color of smoke over water. He was not unkind in that interview. He was simply absent from it, present in body, unreachable in every other direction. At the foot of the steps in November, he was the same. He wore no coat despite the cold, and did not seem to notice the cold. He took her gloved hand briefly and released it. He said the journey, he hoped, had not been excessively fatiguing. She said it had not. He introduced her to the senior staff arranged in 2 lines across the forecourt, and she repeated each name once under her breath as she passed, the way her father had taught her, so that she could use them correctly at dinner. Lady Dorothea Ashford was not at the foot of the steps. She was waiting at the head of them. Edmund's mother was 60 years old and occupied the top step with the settled authority of a woman who had occupied every room she had ever stood in and found the room the better for it. She wore deep violet silk, which managed to suggest mourning and command simultaneously. And her expression when she looked at Charlotte held the quality of an appraisal conducted with instruments too fine to be visible. She said that Miss O'Brien, she trusted, had found the northern air refreshing. The slight emphasis on Miss rather than the Duchess Charlotte was now entitled to be was too light to be called deliberate, too precise to be accidental. Charlotte met her gaze and said the air was very fine, and that she looked forward to learning the household's customs so as not to disturb them unnecessarily. Dorothea's expression did not change. She said she was certain Charlotte would manage adequately. That evening, Charlotte dressed for dinner in the gown she had brought for the purpose, which was her best, and which was the color of dove-gray wool, because she had not yet had occasion to order anything better. The housemaid who helped her was a girl named Peg, 14 years old and trying very hard not to stare at the plainness of the trunk's contents. Charlotte thanked her by name and released her early, then sat at the dressing table and looked at herself in the mirror for the 30 seconds she allowed such examinations, and then went down to dinner. The dining room at Harcombe held 16 comfortably and 3 awkwardly. 3 sat at the table that night, Charlotte at Edmund's right hand and Dorothea at his left, with a length of polished mahogany between all of them that could have quartered a drawing room. The room smelled of beeswax and old fires, and something green from a bowl of late holly that sat in the center of the table, looking determined. Edmund spoke very little at dinner. What he said was clipped and direct, and when he addressed Charlotte, it was to pass a dish, or to ask whether she found the soup adequately warm, and each exchange was so brief that it was over before she could arrange her face into an expression appropriate to it. Across the table, Dorothea led what conversation there was, mostly concerning the Harcombe Winter Assembly in 3 weeks' time, and the county families who would attend, and the particular standing of each. Charlotte listened. She filed the names against the faces she would need to learn. She ate her soup while it was still warm. She did not see Edmund's eyes follow her when she turned to ask Peg, who had appeared at the sideboard, whether she had eaten her own supper. She did not see the slight stillness that crossed his face when she reached it. After dinner, Charlotte excused herself at 9 o'clock and climbed the long stair to the east wing, and Peg turned down her bed, and Charlotte thanked her again, and waited for the night to be whatever it was going to be. She was at the window when she heard, at some distance down the corridor, a sound that did not belong to a quiet house at 9 in the evening. It was thin and controlled, the sound of someone crying who had decided not to be heard. She stood very still for a moment, the snow-lit grounds below her, and listened. The sound came from the east passage, which led to the nursery and the rooms assigned for schoolroom use. She put on her wrapper, picked up the candle from the nightstand, and went toward it without allowing herself to consider whether she should. Thomas was 7 years old and sitting with his back against the wainscoting of the east passage, with his knees drawn up and his face pressed to them. He was still wearing his day clothes, which meant no one had come to see him to bed. He had a small wooden horse in his right hand, held very tight. Charlotte sat down on the passage floor, which was cold through her wrapper, and did not offer much comfort, and she did not ask him what was wrong, because she could see what was wrong. She asked him instead whether he liked stories. He lifted his face, which was wet and careful, and he said that he supposed he did. She said she had been told, by a man who had made it a point of study, that there was no grief that did not benefit from a good story at sufficient length. She did not know who the man was. She had invented him for the purpose. Thomas did not ask. She read to him from memory, because she had no book, from 2 chapters of a story about a boy who sailed to the edge of a mapped ocean and found the maps had been wrong, and from a poem about a house that stood so long it began to remember the people it had sheltered, and from a half-remembered tale her father had told her once about a river that ran backward on one night of the year, for reasons the valley had never established. Thomas fell asleep against her shoulder somewhere during the river story. She was not sure exactly when. What she did not know, and could not have known, was that the Duke of Harcombe stood in the corridor at the passage's far end for the better part of an hour and a half, and that he had come there initially because he had heard the sound himself through a study wall that was not as thick as the house's exterior suggested, and that he had stopped at the passage end because he had seen Charlotte sit down on the floor without hesitation, in her wrapper, in the cold, and begin to speak to a child who had not been given what he needed that evening. Edmund Ashford had not expected that. He had expected competence, or at least an absence of evident failure. He had not expected her to sit on a cold stone floor in the East Passage in November because a 7-year-old was weeping alone and no one else had come. He returned to his study without her hearing him. He stood for a long time before the fireplace and its mantel, and on the wall above the mantel, turned so that the painted face looked toward the room's corner rather than out into it, was a portrait of a woman in yellow silk with dark hair and a composed expression. He had turned it in the first year after she died, and had not turned it back, and had never needed to explain this to anyone in the 11 years since, because no one in his household had required him to. Isabel had died on the 14th of March, 11 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon, while the House of Lords was considering an amendment he had been informed was critical, and which had failed anyway. She had been in confinement for 36 hours by the time he arrived. The child had not survived either. He had never said so aloud to anyone, because there was nothing to say that the fact itself did not already say more cleanly. He had married Charlotte O'Brien because the estate required a mistress, and because the entail on the Westbrook estate, which bordered his own, required resolution through the marriage settlement. He had not married her expecting anything that resembled what he had observed in the East Passage. He was not yet certain what to do with the observation. If you have found yourself holding your breath through these early pages, it is worth knowing that the story has only just begun to press. Stay with it. 3 days after the wedding, Miss Cecily Vane arrived at Harcombe Hall with her mother and her maid and 3 trunks, which was, by Charlotte's observation, 1 trunk more than a 5-day visit strictly required. She was 20 years old and fair, and wore her confidence the way some women wore their jewels, not as ornament, but as argument. She had been brought at Dorothea's invitation. and her arrival was framed as a kindness to the new Duchess, who would benefit from the society of a lively companion during the weeks of winter isolation. Charlotte thanked Dorothea for the consideration. Dorothea said she was certain that Charlotte, given her provincial habits, would find the assembly season rather more demanding than she anticipated. The word provincial was not new. It had appeared in the private aside on the second evening, when Dorothea had said to Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, in Charlotte's clear hearing, that one could do very little with a provincial, with nothing to recommend her. Charlotte had heard it and continued folding the linen inventory she was reviewing, and had noted the phrase in the same interior ledger where she kept all information that might prove useful at a later date. Cecily at dinner was quick and bright, and turned her questions toward Edmund with the practiced ease of someone who had been told by everyone she knew that her company was worth having. She was not precisely unkind to Charlotte. She was the variety of unkind that operates through omission, through the directed laugh, through the question asked past a person's shoulder as though the person had not spoken. Charlotte bore it with the stillness that 11 months of managing her father's final illness had taught her, which was considerable, and she ate her dinner and asked Mrs. Holt afterward how Thomas had slept. Mrs. Holt, who was 53 years old and had been at Harcombe since before Edmund was born, looked at Charlotte for a moment with an expression that held something Charlotte could not quite categorize. Then she said that Thomas had slept very well, and that he had asked whether the new lady would come to read to him again, and that she had told him she thought it likely. Charlotte said she would come that evening if it was convenient. It was, as it happened, the last genuinely quiet evening for some time. The following morning, Dorothea convened what she called an informal gathering of the county's senior ladies for Charlotte's introduction to Harcombe society. It was arranged in the long drawing room, and Cecily was positioned to Dorothea's right in a chair that caught the best of the morning light through the tall east windows, and Charlotte was seated at the room's far end near the tea-things, where her position naturally suggested service rather than standing. Charlotte poured tea for 11 women with steady hands, and noted each name and each connection as Dorothea made the introductions, and was introduced herself 3 times as Miss O'Brien, a provincial connection of long standing, before the first hour was complete. The third time, a woman named Lady Felton, who was sharp-eyed and who had, Charlotte observed, been watching the room rather than performing in it, said quietly, near Charlotte's elbow, that she believed the address was now Her Grace. Dorothea heard this and smiled, and said she was so accustomed to Charlotte's maiden name that the correction had not yet settled. Charlotte said that these things took time, and offered Lady Felton the lemon biscuits. Lady Felton took one and held Charlotte's gaze for a measured moment longer than the biscuit required. 2 days before the Harcombe Winter Assembly, Dorothea found Charlotte in the estate library reviewing the household accounts, which Charlotte had asked Mrs. Holt for permission to examine, and which contained 3 years of unresolved discrepancies that appeared to trace to a single ledger column that had never been properly corrected. Charlotte had been at the accounts for 2 hours and had made 6 pages of notes in her small, clear hand. Dorothea surveyed this activity with an expression of moderate surprise, as though she had come upon a piece of furniture rearranged without instruction. And then she sat down opposite Charlotte and folded her hands on the table. She said that she had been giving considerable thought to Charlotte's situation. She said that it was evident to anyone of perception that the arrangement, while well-intentioned, had been entered into hastily. She said she had spoken with the family's legal counsel, and that in view of the circumstances, it might be both possible and preferable for Charlotte to accept a settlement in lieu of the marriage continuing, and that the appropriate paper had been prepared. She placed on the table a folded document sealed with the Harcombe crest. Charlotte looked at the seal for a moment. She had learned the Harcombe crest by her second day in the house, because she had made a point of it. 3 birds on a field of blue, with a motto in Latin below that translated approximately as "what is given, holds." She was familiar with the shape and depth of the press the seal left in wax, because she had received correspondence on estate paper twice since her arrival, and had looked at it carefully both times, in the way she looked at everything in a new place. The seal on the document before her was slightly too shallow on the left side. She did not open the document. She said with precision and without raising her voice that she would not sign anything she had not first shown to Mr. Holt, and that she wished Edmund to be present when it was examined, and that she would be grateful if Dorothea would arrange that presence. Dorothea said that Edmund had authorized this course himself, and that his presence was unnecessary. Charlotte said that if that were true, his presence would cost nothing, and should be easily arranged. There was a pause in the library that held all the weight of a room that had stored other people's arguments for 2 centuries. Edmund was found in the east stable by Mrs. Holt, who sent a footman named William, with a note that said only that the Duchess required him in the library as a matter of some urgency. He arrived in 6 minutes, still wearing his riding coat, which told Charlotte that Mrs. Holt had not wasted time on delicacy. He looked at the document on the table. He looked at Dorothea. He looked at Charlotte. Charlotte said, in a voice that was level and cost her something real to keep level, that she had been presented with what was represented as a deed of release, authorized by him, suggesting the marriage could be dissolved by her consent and a private settlement. She said she had not yet opened it, because she wished him to see its condition before she did. She turned the document so that Edmund could examine the seal. He picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. His face, which was in any circumstance a face of extraordinary composure, went very still in a way that was different from its ordinary stillness, the way a river surface goes still just before something moves beneath it. He said, without looking up from the document, that this seal had been pressed with the small estate seal that was kept in the household writing cabinet. He said he had not authorized this document. He said he had not authorized any document of this kind. Dorothea said that Charlotte had clearly misunderstood the arrangement's spirit. Edmund put the document on the table. He said in the same level tone that the document would be conveyed to Mr. Holt by the Morning Post for his examination, and that the small estate seal would be removed from the writing cabinet until further notice, and that nothing on the subject would be discussed further in this room today. Dorothea's expression shifted, very briefly, into something that knew it had overreached. Then she stood, and she left the library, and her footstep down the corridor was slightly faster than her ordinary pace. Edmund stood at the table for a moment after she had gone. Charlotte remained seated. Outside the library window, the first snow of the proper season was beginning to come down again, fine and purposeful. He said, without looking at her, that she had not opened the document. She said she had not. He said that most women in her position would have. She said she had been in her position long enough to know that the only instruments worth signing were the ones she had read, and that she would not have read that one without him present, because it was not the kind of document that should be managed alone. There was a silence in which the snow fell against the window with the quiet persistence of something that intended to accumulate. He said her name, for the first time, without the courtesy title, without the form of address. He said Charlotte. She looked up. He said he would see her at the assembly. The Harcombe Winter Assembly was held on a Thursday evening in the old ballroom of the village hall, which was large enough to accommodate 300, and had done so every year for longer than anyone present could account for. The county came out in full, because the county always came out for the first assembly of the season, and because the word had moved through every drawing room from here to the northern boundary that the new Duchess of Harcombe was to attend, and that opinion on her had not yet settled, and that opinion on her would very likely settle that evening one way or another. The ballroom smelled of evergreen branches and hot candles, and the particular collective warmth of 300 people who had opinions and intended to express them through the medium of the evening's arrangements. Charlotte arrived in the gown she had ordered from the village dressmaker 2 weeks after her arrival at the hall, a deep blue wool, simply cut, with no ornament except a narrow trim of ivory that the dressmaker had suggested, and which Charlotte had accepted. It was not a grand gown. It was a gown that belonged to her, made for her body, and she wore it without apology. Dorothea was already present when they arrived, positioned near the room's best fireplace with Cecily at her side and 3 of the county's most senior ladies arrayed nearby. She watched Charlotte cross the entrance hall with an expression of calibrated assessment. And then she turned to the woman beside her, a Mrs. Trent, who was the magistrate's wife, and who had a carrying voice that she did not often trouble to lower. And she said clearly enough that the words reached the entrance hall that she had always found provincial connections trying at assemblies, as they so rarely knew the forms. Lady Felton, who had arrived moments before and was removing her gloves near the entrance, heard this clearly. She looked at Charlotte, and she did not look away. Charlotte did not look away either. The evening moved through its forms. People were introduced, dances were arranged, the musicians at the room's far end played tolerably and were largely ignored by everyone except Charlotte and Thomas, who was present for the first hour before Mrs. Holt would take him home, and who had stationed himself at Charlotte's elbow and was conducting a running account of the musicians' choices in a low and earnest voice. Charlotte bent her head to hear him, and answered seriously when he asked whether the second violin was slightly behind the others. She said she thought he might be, and that it was the sort of thing only an attentive ear would catch. Thomas took this assessment with the satisfaction of a child given the right kind of answer, and leaned slightly against her arm. Edmund, from the far side of the room, watched this. His expression was what it always was, which was to say contained and still and perfectly unreadable to anyone who had not spent 6 weeks observing it closely enough to learn that what looked like distance was in fact the discipline a specific kind of grief produces in a man who has decided that control is the only safe form of love. Charlotte had learned this. She had not been certain whether she had learned it correctly until tonight. Dorothea crossed to Charlotte near the end of the first hour and said, with the smile of a woman delivering a public service, that she believed Cecily danced the next set with Edmund, and that it would be most suitable if Charlotte stood with the married ladies during it, as the arrangement was so widely expected. Charlotte said that she would stand wherever she was comfortable, and that she did not anticipate inconvenience. The musicians were beginning to arrange themselves for the next set when she felt, rather than heard, a change in the room's particular weather. 300 people who had been distributing their attention across the whole of the evening directed it, in the space of a few seconds, toward a single point. She turned because the room's redirected attention was pulling her gaze before she had decided to turn, and she saw Edmund crossing the ballroom floor. He was not crossing it toward Cecily, who was standing at the room's center with her dance card and her certainty arranged around her like a considered composition. He was crossing it toward Charlotte. He moved at the deliberate pace of a man who was not rushing because he did not need to rush, because the thing he was walking toward had already been decided, and the only question was how many people would witness the decision, and the answer was 300, which he had apparently found sufficient. The room went quiet in the graduated way a room goes quiet when it understands that what is happening is not rehearsal. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had looked at the document in the library, with the whole of his attention gathered behind his eyes. Then he said, in a voice that carried to at least the inner circle of the room and was not raised a degree beyond the level required for that carry, that he believed the next dance was his wife's, and that he would like to claim it. if she was willing. Thomas, at Charlotte's elbow, looked up at Edmund with the expression of someone receiving news whose full significance he understood slightly better than adults generally expected him to. Lady Felton, near the fireplace, was watching Dorothea. Dorothea's expression, for the first time in Charlotte's 6 weeks at Harcombe, had nothing further to say. Cecily stood at the room's center for the space of 3 composed breaths, and then she turned to the young man who had been waiting hopefully on her left all evening, and she accepted his hand, and she carried herself with the dignity appropriate to a woman who had learned that the field had changed without advertising the learning. Charlotte was glad of it. She had not wished for Cecily's humiliation. She had only wished for accuracy. Edmund offered his hand. Charlotte placed her gloved hand in his, and they walked to the floor. She did not know, in that moment, the full shape of what had just occurred. She knew the weight of the room's attention, and the warmth of the room after the cold she had been standing in. Not the physical cold, but the other kind. The kind that comes from being named a provisional presence in the rooms where you live. She knew that Edmund's hand was steady, and that her own was steadier than she had expected. She knew that the musicians were beginning, and that the set was a reel, which required real attention, and that Thomas was watching from the side with both hands clasped at his chest. She found out the rest on the following morning, when Mr. Holt arrived from Bath with the confirmed examination of the deed of release, which was, as Charlotte had suspected, and Edmund had known when he looked at the seal, an unauthorized document. The Harcombe estate seal had never been pressed to it. What had been pressed to it was the small writing cabinet seal, which was available to the household's domestic authority, and had been used in the apparent belief that Charlotte would not know the difference. Mr. Holt presented this finding in the Harcombe library in the presence of Edmund and Charlotte and Dorothea and Lady Felton, who had called that morning for reasons she described as a social visit, and which served additionally as witness. Edmund received the finding without expression. Then he looked at Dorothea, and he said her name once, and what followed between them was conducted in terms that Charlotte understood to be final. Not cruel. Final. Dorothea was to move to the Harcombe Dower House on the estate's western boundary, a house which was comfortable and considerable, and which had been maintained for exactly this contingency. She was to remove there by the new year. She was not to correspond with the estate's legal counsel without Edmund's prior knowledge. She was not to have access to any document of the estate's authority. Dorothea heard this. She looked, for one unguarded moment, at Charlotte. The single short truth in her expression was not malice. It was recognition. She had misjudged the instrument, and she knew it now, and the knowing had arrived too late. She said she would require a week to arrange her belongings. Edmund said she might have 2. Mr. Holt additionally confirmed in the same meeting that the instrument of debt representing the £4,200 Charlotte had carried from her father's estate had been cancelled at the time of the marriage settlement as agreed, and that his copy of the cancellation had been registered in Bath on the 8th of October. He had brought the registered confirmation for Charlotte's personal keeping, which was the service she had asked him for, by letter 3 days prior. She thanked him by name and received the paper and filed it in the small locked writing case she kept in her own chamber, where she kept everything that was hers. He departed before noon, with a warm good day to Mrs. Holt, and a look in Charlotte's direction that contained the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for 11 months to deliver a result he could stand behind. 3 days before Christmas, the snow came in earnest to Harcombe Hall, heavy and unhurried, covering the park and the drive and the bare trees of the east garden, until the whole landscape outside the library window was one unbroken white. The fire in the library had been lit since morning, and had achieved by evening the deep amber glow of a fire that has had sufficient time to settle into itself. Mrs. Holt had arranged tea, and there were books on the low table by the south chair, and Thomas had fallen asleep on the hearthrug with his wooden horse still in his hand, in the exhausted collapse of a child who has spent the afternoon in full campaign against the estate's snowfall. Charlotte sat in the south chair with her feet tucked under her, which was not strictly proper, and which she had permitted herself anyway, and she was reading. The house was quiet in the particular way of houses that have had their official business concluded for the day and are now simply being inhabited. Edmund came into the library at 8:30. He stopped for a moment when he saw Thomas on the hearthrug, and the expression that crossed his face was brief and layered, and cost him something to let surface. But it surfaced. He looked at Thomas with the eyes of a man who was still learning that tenderness did not necessarily end in loss. He crossed to the fireplace and stood for a moment, and then he turned. Above the mantel, the portrait of Isabel in her yellow silk looked out now into the room rather than toward the corner. He had turned it back, Charlotte knew, on the morning after the assembly. She had not asked him about it. He had not explained it. Some things did not require the architecture of words. He looked at the portrait for a moment, and then he looked away. And the quality of his looking away was different from the quality it had held for 11 years. It was not release from grief. Grief of that shape does not release. It was the beginning of the ability to carry it as a known weight rather than an unacknowledged one, which is a different and more livable thing. He sat down in the chair across from Charlotte. He did not pick up a book. He looked at Thomas on the hearthrug, and then at Charlotte in her chair, and then at the fire. And for a length of time neither of them spoke. And the silence was the kind of silence that has no pressure in it. She looked up from her book after a while and found him looking at her. He said her name. He said Charlotte. Not your grace, not the form of address, but her name, the way he had said it in the library that afternoon with the snow coming down. She waited. He said that he was aware he had not been easy to live with. He said it with the precision of a man choosing his words because he wanted them accurate rather than ornamental. And she understood from the precision that this was not a practiced speech, but a considered one. He said that he had not intended to be cold. He said that cold had been, for 11 years, the only arrangement he knew how to manage in. Charlotte closed her book. She said she had not found him cold. Precisely. She said she had found him contained, which was a different thing, and that she thought she understood something about what had produced the containment, and that she did not require him to dissolve it entirely, only perhaps to leave the door of it occasionally open. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to say the thing that wanted to be said. He said that on the night of their wedding he had stood outside her door, and he had not knocked, because he had decided 2 days before arriving that the transaction she was expecting was not one he was willing to make. He said that a contracted marriage did not entitle him to anything she had not freely given, and that she had entered the arrangement without expectation of anything tender, and that he had thought, if he was patient, she might eventually know him well enough to determine whether tenderness was possible. He stopped there. Outside the library windows, the snow fell on, and the parkland lay white and still under it, and the fire spoke in the language of old wood, and Thomas slept on the hearthrug with his wooden horse. Charlotte looked at Edmund Ashford, Duke of Harkham, 38 years old, and 11 years into a discipline that had just opened its door. And she thought that she had come to this house braced for a transaction, and had found instead a man who was capable of standing outside a door rather than pressing through it, and that this capacity, quiet and costly and utterly unremarked by the world that assessed such things, was worth more to her than all the rest of the Hall's stone and acreage combined. She said that she thought, If he was patient, she would come to know him very well indeed. He looked at the fire. Something in his face settled, not into coldness, but into the quieter country on the other side of it, the place where a man arrives when he has stopped requiring himself to be stone. He said that he could be patient. Charlotte opened her book again but did not read, and he did not reach for one either. And the library held them both in the fire-lit warmth, while the snow accumulated on the sills, and the December dark pressed close against the glass, and Thomas slept on without dreaming. Thomas did not stay asleep for very long. He stirred at 9 o'clock, sat up with his horse, looked at the two adults in the chairs by the fire with the assessing gaze of a 7-year-old who has learned to read rooms, and announced that he was hungry. Edmund told him there would be something in the kitchen if Mrs. Holt had left anything out, and that he should put on his coat before he went down the passage. Thomas looked at Charlotte, and she looked at him, and she said she would come and check the passage temperature before he went, because the East Passage in December was its own particular climate, and a coat alone might not answer. Thomas said that he thought that was sensible. He took her hand as they walked toward the library door, unselfconsciously, the way children take the hand that is offered to them when they are not yet old enough to know they should not need it. Charlotte looked back once before they stepped into the passage, and Edmund was still in his chair by the fire, watching them go. And his expression was the one she had been trying to name for 6 weeks. She named it now. It was not cold. It had never been cold. It was a man looking at the thing he had not allowed himself to hope for, and finding it, against 11 years of reasonable expectation, to be real. The fire settled behind them with the sound of something long held finally releasing, and the snow went on falling on Harcombe Hall as though it had always belonged there, white and unhurried and without end. If Charlotte's story moved you, leave a word for her in the comments. She waited a long time to be seen, and the people who witness these things, even across the distance of a story, are part of how the witnessing holds.